Thank you, Anangwe. Normally, when I'm introduced to such events, at least in the last few years, I'm usually introduced as a former this, a former the other, a former this. So former minister, former president of ADB, former Global Fund, former this. I've had great difficulties letting people know I'm still alive. So Anangwe, thank you for not using that prefix. But it's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the government and the organizers for inviting me. I also want to commend the government and the partners and each one of you for putting this important event together. As I'm sure you heard just now, in 2019, African leaders adopted the ALM, whose goals and objectives you have heard, whose roadmap you well know. In short, how to assure better health for our people. Now, they lay down with great clarity the importance of more money for health and more health for money. They set clear objectives: how much share of the budget, how much share of national income, what is the limit on out-of-pocket expenditures, and then they requested our president to champion this exercise. So what we're doing today, like other African countries are doing or will do, is to take stock where we are and look forward, as you have just heard. So our excellent panel, which is coming here shortly, with very experienced and talented people with national, global responsibilities, will walk us through where we are, including how Rwanda has managed to navigate that space more than I can explain. So in the 15 minutes allocated to me, I want just to delve in some broader contextual issues, and I'll be making just 4 points. So point number one, as soon as the ALM was adopted, we had COVID-19, with its impact on health, impact on the economies. So it was clear then, as it is now, that meeting the ALM financial objectives would be a bigger challenge, to which now we add a lot of fiscal issues, including debt and the global turbulences. But as they say, behind every cloud, there is a silver lining and lessons learned. And I can think of a couple of lessons from COVID, which are relevant to your discussion. First, COVID powerfully demonstrated, if any was needed, the strong link between health and the economy. In fact, for many countries in Africa, COVID was much more an economic crisis than a health crisis. It demonstrated that health investments have very high economic returns, and so is the opposite. And especially so in countries like ours, where demographic dynamics were there. The last census done here in Rwanda showed that 78% of our people are below 35. And those who are below 15 are equal to 35%. Just think of those numbers and what it means in terms of the investment we have to make in the young population. Second lesson from COVID, at least from my perspective, was that robust health systems are the best way to prepare for pandemic, any pandemic, those who have known or those to come. But then there's a question. How does Africa, with the limited fiscal room, do so without chronic dependence on external partners? I say chronic dependence on external partners. Now, here's another lesson. When you critically look at how countries, rich or poor, responded to COVID-19, we find something extraordinary. That the outcomes across countries, rich or poor, were very different. Some reasonably poor countries did extremely well in COVID-19. Some very rich countries did very badly on COVID-19. even those spending up of $4,000 per capita on health. You have read the literature, I don't have to go through that. And so that for me, and for many people, suggests something important for our discussion. That beyond how much money we spend on health, that is necessary, but it is not a sufficient condition. I'll return to this point shortly. Next, and finally, COVID demonstrated that the importance of looking at our own supply chains, that relying entirely on global supply chains for things we need for our people, like medicines, vaccines, and equipment, is extremely risky. So I want to do, in the next 10, 15 minutes, walk you through some of these points and share with you my views, which might help you in our conversation. But as I say, you have got a very capable panel, which will do better than me in this. So point number one, I want to share with you. So why did countries, rich or poor, perform so differently on COVID response? There is a region, for example, in northern Italy, I think around Lombardy, which did rather poorly on COVID outcomes. But then you have got countries with less income, maybe like Vietnam, like Rwanda here, who did much better than countries spending much more on health. So what is the problem? I think, as many friends have said, the answer is something intangible. It is called social capital. It's called trust. It's called the role of communities. Now, social capital is built not simply on how much money you spend on a particular sector. It is how you collect it, how you spend it, on whom you spend. It is built on effective social safety nets and strong community involvement. I'm sure the Minister of Health, who is here, will be sharing with you how Rwanda navigated this issue, but I cannot overemphasize this matter. The simple focus on how much money we collect and spend on health without incorporating this issue of social capital is vitally important. So COVID tested both our health systems, but also our social capital. Minister, I'm sure you'll be coming to this issue because you did very well on this issue around here, and I think it is vitally important. I believe that while Rwanda did reasonably well on COVID and vaccination than many other countries, is probably built on, I would want to say, a very high level of trust in our public financial management. Look, we're not perfect, but I think the public financial management in Rwanda is doing fairly well on many indicators, and the public knows that. They know that when we collect 16% of GDP in revenue, there is something which they can see, which the money does. So that builds trust. There is low tolerance for corruption. That the public knows. Number two, there are issues around community health insurance, community health workers, as you have heard. Then there's issues around simple technologies, and then institutional coherence. These are things, rather than simply availability of vaccines, which actually enable the country to do very well in the COVID response. But again, I leave this to my friend, the Minister of Health, who will be articulating this. But it has a relevance for countries who are not in this room, like Nigeria, for example. You see, Nigeria, which is the first or the second largest economy, depending how you calculate it, has been spending about $10 billion per year on oil subsidies. $10 billion per year on oil subsidies. Angola spends about $4 billion. Now, the problem is blanket subsidies is that they often don't benefit those actually who need them. They benefit the most those who don't need them. All right? And they're a huge drain on the fiscal resources. So the new government in Nigeria has decided to abolish the oil subsidies, which I vastly welcome. But it's important at the same time to ensure that those who need the subsidies, you have the safety nets for them. So here you have an example of how you can actually raise more resources for health, for safety nets, without asking for more taxes. But that is not subject for today. We can discuss it another time. The second point is around the trade-offs and choices which have to be made as we raise funding for health. In many of our countries, the outcomes of health are not simply a function of how much money you spend in the health ministry. There are outcomes of social investments that we make in water and sanitation, in clean energy, clean cooking stoves, in nutrition, and I could go on. I gather you people call them determinants of health. All I'm saying is, it's not simply how much money you spend in the means of health, it is how you spend across the health determinants. So choices have to be made in the health sector and between the health sector and the other sectors, such as water, energy, agriculture, and so on. In addition, across all these sectors, there are multiple actors, donors, philanthropy, IFIs, international financial institutions, and then specialized institutions like the Global Fund, for which I welcome my friend Peter's presence today. Now, why is this important? Look, over the last 8 years, here in Africa, we have made a lot of progress on infant mortality, on major pandemics and disease burden overall. But we have to acknowledge that it's in many countries largely to a global coalition around international financial institutions, philanthropy like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, business, institutions such as PEPFAR, the Global Fund, Gavi, which supplemented the national efforts. Now, the relative share of how much the international effort contributes to each country varies from country to another. But the key point is that whatever share it is important to ensure alignment, coordination, and greater ownership. And that is the point I'm making. That demands very strong collaboration between the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Finance, and other social sector ministries. This alignment, this coordination is not possible unless there is a whole government approach along these lines. And you could also see that during COVID. But it requires more than government. It is government, it is partners, it is business, it is communities, it is members of parliament, civil groups, each in their own role, but coherently working in tandem. So it is not just the role of the Minister of Health alone. And I'm happy to see that in this room we have many people from other departments, including finance, I hope other social sector ministers as well. The important thing I want to leave here, my friends, is that international support is great. We've together achieved a lot. But one day, it will no longer be there. I'm not saying it is tomorrow, but one day it will no longer be there. And we need to plan for that day. And that planning begins yesterday. And especially at a time when the global system is dealing with multiple competing goals, especially the global public goods, climate, fragility, security, as is the case now. So the point I'm making is that the cooperation between Ministers of Health and Finance and others is not necessary just for the purpose of planning for that day or ensuring coherence, but also ensuring that as we discuss climate, fragility, security at the global level, these things are not unnecessarily put in competition. There's no competition between climate adaptation and health expenditures. They are one and the same thing. You fail in one, you fail in the other. You fail in one, you fail in the other. Recently, I was visiting a country where, to my judgment as a non-expert, I think the biggest health problem they face is child stunting. They have the highest per capita level of child stunting I've ever seen. And so if you have got climate issues, which they cannot adapt to, and food crops are failing, there will be a problem. Now, is that health or or is that climate? And so the cooperation between ministers of health, finance, and others is exactly important for this reason as well. Now, I know I've been given 15 minutes, so am I already there? Is that right? That is a good one. So my third point is this. I said I had 4 points. Huh? So my third point is this. I think someone referred to it just now. That was an excellent point. It is true that communicable diseases like HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, despite a lot of achievements, which was described capably here, remain our biggest challenge. That is a fact across Africa. But here is the dilemma. The last census again here in Rwanda showed that life expectancy is now getting close to 70 years. In many African countries, actually, it's close to 65. Now, just reflect about this number. I hope this does not get me in trouble with some people, but let me say it nonetheless. When colonial powers arrived in Africa, I've checked with different people, statistics were not as good at the time. Life expectancy was about 28 years, below 30. That is at the turn of the century. As I say, statistics were bad, so we don't know, but roughly that number. By the time colonial powers left at the beginning of the 60s, life expectancy was not very far from 40. But if I'm wrong, Nsanzimana, please correct me so that the record is clear, 40 years. Now, in many African countries, it's above 60. And like here in Rwanda, we are now close to 70. Now, that is at once an indication of a huge success in living conditions of our people. It's a huge success, which we have to celebrate. But it comes with a price. The price is the one our colleagues referred to, the increase in non-communicable diseases linked to lifestyle, food, and the rest of it. So, because of the improving economic conditions, health conditions, life expectancy has gone up. But that means, as we look for resources for the health sector, for communicable diseases, we have also to look for resources for non-communicable diseases. So, how do we get the right balance between the two? This is so complicated, I leave this to Nsanzimana. My fourth and last point is the one I referred to earlier. Again, a lesson from COVID. How do we ensure that we have access to reliable supplies for what we need for our people? For prevention, such as vaccines. For diagnostics, like testing kits. For therapeutics, like drugs. It was quite painful to see that many African countries during COVID struggled to get even masks, oxygen. Actually, in my ignorance, please forgive me, I didn't know that oxygen had to be manufactured. I thought oxygen is in there. I was then educated by people who know that, no, it's not like that, Mr. Kaberuka, it's so more complicated. But masks, oxygen, we even had to struggle for that, let alone vaccines. Now, I'm not unaware of the complex nature of this problem, the investments needed, both local and foreign. I'm not unaware of the complications around the regulatory systems, safety, and the realities of the markets and uptake. All I'm saying is, we have little choice. And on this, there is a conversation to be had across the spectrum of governments, business, philanthropy, IFIs, and international organizations like the Global Fund, Gavi, and others. It's an important conversation, as we have started here in Rwanda in terms of vaccine manufacturing. It can no longer be that we have to depend on the cheapest point of production. I think that is maybe sensible economics, I don't know. But now we're moving to that point where we also need to look at the reliability of that supply chains, especially when we need it. Now, again, that is another issue which I think there's no longer controversy, but it is one where there is a little misunderstanding in some in the international community. Well, should Africa be entering vaccine manufacturing? But the same was said when India began manufacturing vaccines, exactly the same arguments. And so all I'm saying is it's a lessons we learned, which we have to draw from. So let me end where I began. And now we saw now, I'm ending where I began. ALM was well defined by the leaders. We know the direction of travel. Countries like Rwanda, highly committed. There is significant progress. But we're off track in many African countries on spending per capita or spending the share of GDP. Now, COVID and geopolitics has complicated the fiscal space. New priorities or new ways of addressing them mean that if we're not careful, we end up with competition, as I've just mentioned, between resources for climate change, pandemic, security, which is not necessary. These things are integral to one another. Now, as I end this conversation, can I ask you to put up? I'm just putting here to provoke your thoughts during our conversation. This Professor Chiman from Harvard School of Public Health, when I think they put something in your folders, please look up what she said in this article. And the article is called 21st Century Barefoot Doctors. You can dig it up and see. Now, this is a story, just schematically. 50 years ago, during a period quite difficult in China. By the way, for those of you who don't follow these things, at the time, China was poorer than Zimbabwe. You heard me? So China was going through difficult issues, politically, socially, and so on. But it was also facing a huge problem with communicable diseases. Massive problems with communicable diseases. So what did they do? They mobilized 1.5 million peasants. 1.5 million peasants. These peasants received 3 to 6 months intensive training in medical care. Then they were dispatched to their communities to provide basic health care. But they remained farmers, rice farmers. This is why they're called barefoot doctors. It's not because they were barefoot, please don't misunderstand it. It is because they were part-time in the rice paddy farming in water and part-time looking after communities on the way they were trained. In fact, some people call them farmers stroke doctors rather than barefoot doctors. Now, what does the professor say? She says, this low-tech, low-cost, community-based approach was very successful in dealing with communicable diseases. This is well documented. Those of you in this room who are in public health will know this. It was extremely successful. Indeed, he said that this is what influenced the famous 1978 Alma Ata Declaration on Primary Health Care. Why? Number one, it's universalism, universal health access. It reached everyone. Number two, low tech, low cost. And number three, community-based. Now, Professor is not saying we should go back to those times. Indeed, many experts disagree. Some people think this was okay, but. All she's saying, if I read the article correctly, by the way, even China in the 1980s, when they were getting richer, more prosperous, they abandoned to something else. Her arguments are quite simple. Our fiscal room is very tight. Our population is growing. However, as I think the presenters were saying just now, there are technology disruptions at the moment, such as artificial intelligence. That's big data, which offers an opportunity to innovate. We don't have to go back to 50 years ago. But combining these universalist approaches, community-based, with technology, we might be able to ensure better outcomes at lower per capita cost. Look, here in Rwanda, drones have been used to deliver blood products. Drones have blood products. Cell phones have been used, I'm told, to deliver information on some aspects of healthcare. So as we talk about more money for health, more health for our money, equity, and innovation, let us think through how we can actually do as much as we can in the context of the world today of technology, of global turbulence, of reduced fiscal room, see how we can deliver greater product. I'm afraid that sometimes we may want to focus on how much money shall we generate, what is the target per capita, rather than actually can we do much more with what we have today, as this country has demonstrated. I want you to reflect on that. Now, there's a lot of expertise in this room, more than I can offer, and we will delve in these issues more effectively. So all I want to do is to thank you for inviting me, for your time, for what you do, and wish you well. Rwanda and Africa will forever be thankful for the commitment you bring to these issues, for the health of our people, and as we search for solutions for the future. Thank you for listening to me.